Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Reborn Muslim, the podcast by and for reverts to Islam. I'm your host Avalon, and today I want to talk about some red flags to look out for when somebody is offering you some Islamic advice, and I'm using that term loosely. Basically, just when somebody tells you something that you should or should not be doing as a Muslim. Here are some red flags to look out for because as a revert, it can be hard to know what is reputable and what's not, who is reputable and who's not. And, just like kind of have a baseline understanding of what you should automatically question. You know what I'm saying? Because we all have our things that we're experts in, or maybe not experts, but we know a lot about. And if somebody says something that's questionable, we can automatically, alarm bells ring in our head and we're like, like, where'd you hear that? I don't know about that. But when we're new reverts, we don't have that baseline, like instinct with Islam yet. We don't know enough, most likely. Maybe you've been looking into Islam for a long time, but for most of us, I would say when we first convert, we don't have that ability. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Just here are some red flags from my own experience, some things to look out for. And as I always mention, I'm not a scholar. Please don't take my word for it. These are not like actual rulings or anything. I would be a hypocrite if I gave rulings in this very episode that I'm, saying not to do that. So please just take this as advice from your peer, from a fellow Muslim, just telling you, hey, if you notice something like this, maybe look into it yourself. Maybe ask a sheikh or an imam. Just do your own research and just don't take it to heart immediately. Just in general, we should never just take some Islamic ruling that somebody told us to heart immediately and not question it. We should always question it and try to find out where it's coming from. But here are some specific things to look out for. So, inshallah, this will be helpful, especially for reverts. But even if you're a born Muslim and maybe you didn't grow up in a super religious household, or if you're a born Muslim that's kind of coming back to Islam, back on your journey. So, inshallah, this should be helpful for us all, I hope. And let's get started. Bismillah. So, the way I want to open this episode up is just giving you some examples of Islamic advice that I had been given in the past, which immediately rang alarm bells for me, even as a new Muslim, and that I was able to, do the research on and figure out that, in fact, these things were completely fabricated. They were not true at all. By the way, none of these were coming from sheikhs or anything. I wasn't confused about that. They were just coming from born Muslims who, seem to think that they're sheikhs or seem to think that they, are a scholar in some way. So, without further ado, let's just get into these crazy, crazy statements. And then afterwards, inshallah, I'll get into the actual things to look out for. And hopefully, that'll bring it all together to show you why these statements were so wrong. So, the first one is you don't have to wear hijab in the West, for example, America. You don't have to wear hijab in the West because hair is not considered immodest here in the West or in America. This one came up in my mind recently because a sister was telling me how born Muslim, she's a revert, and a born Muslim told her this, and it really confused her and made her question everything. And literally, the exact same thing happened to me early on in my journey. A born Muslim man told me this, and I was so confused. Again, alarm bells were going off in my head with this sister, they were going off in her head as well, which is why she reached out to me about it. So that shows that we automatically were like, something's wrong about this. We both had that experience, and yet we weren't sure. And so that's one example. Next one, I have been told this many times over. As I've said many times on the podcast and elsewhere, I'm vegan. I've been vegan for 4 years. And people will sometimes tell me not eating meat is haram. So let me repeat that. To not eat meat is haram. So, in other words, to be vegetarian or vegan is haram. I'll leave it at that. And the last one I'll mention is, and you might not think this is real, but unfortunately, this is really something somebody told me. This is a real thing a Muslim man told me. If a man asks for your hand, so if a man proposes marriage to you, you do not have the right to say no. You have to say yes. So it's not really even a proposal. It's just if a man asks you to marry him, you must comply. You must marry him. I know what you're thinking. No way somebody told you that. Yeah, someone actually did tell me that. Very disturbing, to say the least. So, with all of those examples in mind, again, these things were told to me very early on as a Muslim, and I didn't have the, baseline knowledge of Islam to be able to specifically cite things and say, no, I know that's not true, or the resources to go to an imam and say, what's up with this? Is this true? You know what I mean? So I didn't have those resources at the time. But even back then, without the resources and as a new Muslim, these things were strange to me. So let's get into why these things were wrong, why they, automatically seemed off to me. And furthermore, things that you should look out for when somebody's giving you, again, quote unquote, Islamic advice or, telling you something that you shouldn't do or you should do. So, Bismillah. So, the first one that I'll mention is that just straight up, it does not follow logic. It's just like they tell you the ruling, quote unquote, they're what this thing you should be doing, this thing you shouldn't be doing, whatever it might be. It doesn't make logical sense. It does not follow logic. And furthermore, they don't give you a logical explanation. They, even if it's like, because here's the thing, here's an example. When I first learned that like it's a sunnah to eat with your right hand, if you just say that and leave it at that, it might not necessarily follow logic, right? Because I thought about that for a long time. I was like, what is the logic behind eating with your right hand? I was like, most sunnahs have some kind of logic behind it, or like they just make sense, or any like actual ruling, like obligation, I'm like, what is the logic behind that? And I actually looked into it and realized that we're supposed to, not to get graphic, but we're supposed to like take care of all of that with our left hand, and then we're supposed to eat with our right hand. That's why it's a sunnah, to my understanding. Again, I'm not a scholar. Don't quote me on it, but that's my understanding of it. And then once I put it in that context, I was like, well, that makes perfect sense because it makes sense, and like it's just cleaner to do one of those things with one hand and the other thing with the other hand, and to not intermix those hands. So I was like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. So you see what I'm saying? Even if it doesn't make logical sense upon first glance, if you look into it, there should be a logical explanation. It should not just be absolutely out of the blue. Another thing, which again just follows logic, it's an obligation on us and it follows logic, is the headscarf. So if you're a human, you know that there should probably be some amount of boundaries set on the interactions that men and women have in public, right? Or in society. Men and women that are not married and are not family members, right? There should be some sort of, rules there, or like societal norms. I think we can all say that, even though people want to say that we shouldn't have any restrictions anymore. If you're just using your brain, there's things that a man and a woman aren't going to do alone that two women might do alone, or two men might do alone, or etc. You might do with your family. And it's just not appropriate to do that with a man and a woman alone who are not married. It's just logic. It just makes sense. It's protection for the women mostly. And it's also just like, it makes sense. It doesn't put you in these uncomfortable situations. Like, for example, would you want, if you're a married woman, would you want your husband hanging out with a female friend alone? Probably not. Or if you're a man, would you want your wife, the same thing, hanging out with a male friend alone? Probably gonna say definitely not. So these are just logical things. So to have the headscarf, to abide by modesty, it all goes hand in hand, and of course, modesty, the point of it is we're submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the idea behind every obligation. But the practical application of it is it limits our interactions with the opposite sex, and it limits what they can see of us. And so going back to that first example of, oh, you don't have to wear the hijab in the West because hair's not immodest here. So this goes against that, right? Because if we're just going by cultural standards of whatever country we literally just happen to be in, then it's going to be different in every country, first of all. And secondly, by that logic, because again, this statement of you don't have to wear the hijab in the West, it's not logical. Because if you're following that logic, then you don't have to wear a shirt in the West, or you don't have to wear a shirt as a Muslimah in the West either, because wearing a bikini is not immodest. Like, let's just be real. Wearing a bikini is not seen as immodest in America. That's perfectly normal. Like, it's a perfectly normal thing to wear here. So by that logic, you can just wear bikinis as a Muslimah, and then that's fine. But obviously, we know that's not the case, okay? If we're using our brain for 1 second, like, let's just be real. We know that's not the case. We have specific obligations on us. So again, is it logical to say, well, just wear whatever whatever is considered modest by that country? What if it's like a nudist country, if that's like a normal thing there? You know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't follow logic. We have specific guidelines, so we don't need to follow what a culture says. So again, if it's not logical, there's no logical explanation, that should be an immediate red flag. Definitely pursue answers from a scholar, as I always say. Okay, next one. So if it doesn't align with the general values and beliefs that we hold as Muslims, okay, because even if you're a brand new Muslim, you should have a baseline understanding of like, who are we as Muslims? What do we believe broadly, right? Because if you didn't, you wouldn't convert to Islam if you had absolutely no idea. So, like, what are some examples? Well, of course, we should be submitting to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala above all else. That should be our number one. We should be respectful with everybody we come across, whether they're Muslim or not. We should not inflict harm on anyone for no reason, including animals. We should be kind and respectful towards animals as well. We should not go to extremes in anything, but we should also not slack on our obligations and just, make it easy for ourselves. And we should be generous with the people who are less fortunate than us. So these are just some examples, right? Of like, what do we believe as Muslims? Who are we as Muslims? Again, those are just a few examples. So if a supposed ruling that somebody is presenting to you and saying you have to do this or you can't do this, if it doesn't align with those kind of basic moral principles that we have as Muslims, immediately question it, immediately look for more resources on that, because it should not go against everything we believe as Muslims, right? Because the thing is, Islamic values are cohesive. They're not just hodgepodge of random things drawn together and they have nothing in common. That's just not the way it is. That's just not the reality. They all go together. They all go in one direction. So if all of a sudden somebody's, pulling this ruling out of nowhere and it just completely is counter to all of that, you need to question it. You should not take that at face value. So the example I gave of like you have to eat meat, in other words, it's haram to not eat meat. That doesn't make sense, right? First of all, it's not logical, but also it doesn't align with our values, because our values are to be, kind and to be respectful to every living being, even animals. And that doesn't mean we can't eat meat as Muslims. Of course not. That's why we have halal meat. However, if you think about it, the only restrictions that we have on what we can eat are on meat, or on types of meat we can't eat. You know what I mean? Like if it's not halal, if it's not killed in a humane, quick way. So with all of those examples of, again, what we kind of believe as Muslims in mind, going back to the example I gave at the beginning of if a man asks for your hand, if he proposes to you, you have to say yes. How does that align with any of that? We know that women have a special status in Islam. We are protected. We have so many rights. And I mean, not a status above men, don't get me wrong. But, we are very protected and we have so many rights just specifically for us. And you're supposed to treat a woman so special and supposed to treat a woman with so much respect. And how does that at all go along with you have to marry somebody just because they ask you? That doesn't make sense, right? Like that doesn't go along with what we believe as Muslims. And that might seem like an extreme example, like, oh, well, who's really saying those things? But like I told you, people are out there saying things like this, okay? People are out there saying ridiculous things that literally do not align with our values as Muslims and saying that it's an Islamic ruling. So again, if it's not cohesive with the rest of what we believe as Muslims, if it's just totally out of left field and doesn't line up with everything else, you should definitely be questioning it and looking into the validity of it, even if you don't feel comfortable asking that person. Because obviously, that guy who told me you have to, because just to give you a little more context, he said you have to marry me because I'm asking. And I think it was on like Instagram. He just like found my account and DM'd me. So obviously he got a block and a report right away. So I didn't have I wasn't going to sit there and ask him, oh, where did you hear that? What was your citation? Because it was so absurd. So again, like even if you don't feel comfortable asking them, you should be looking into it on your own. Okay, the next red flag that I would say you need to look out for is it kind of goes along with, if it doesn't align with our values, but it's a little different. So like if you just never heard anything similar, you've just never heard anything like that before. So again, we have cohesive values as Muslims. It's not just like it's all going in one direction morally, like we have this certain moral obligations and beliefs, but also if you're just using your brain, it's like everything kind of goes together. We don't have, again, we don't have all these random rulings that have nothing in common. That's just not the reality of the situation. So if you've never heard literally anything like what this person is telling you, like you're hearing this and you're just thinking, where is this coming from? Like I've never heard anything like this, even if it doesn't seem to disrupt logic, or it doesn't seem to go against our morals. You just have literally never heard anything like it. Again, question it and look into it more. Because going back to the examples at the beginning, I would say the one of like not eating meat is haram. People telling me I can't be vegan and it's haram for me to avoid meat. That's kind of one of these examples I would say where it's just like I had never heard something like that before. I had never come across anything like that in the Quran or from the sunnahs that I knew, from the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Like nothing about any of those things that I knew indicated that we have to eat meat. It just didn't really make sense to me. I'm like, this just like, again, this just isn't something I've ever heard before. And I would like to make the disclaimer that sometimes you are going to come across actual legitimate fatwas that are something you've never heard of before. You just, oh wow, I didn't know that was something we had to do, or I didn't know that was something that we should avoid, for example. Those things are going to happen. Probably you're not going to know everything when you first convert to Islam, right? So you probably are going to come across things that you're like, I've never heard of that before. So that's why I label all of these things as red flags rather than, immediately say, no, that's not true and don't even look into it more. So somebody might tell you something that, like, for like the example I mentioned, when I would hear you have to eat meat, I was like, well, I've just never heard something like that before, but let me look into it because I don't want to do something that's un-Islamic. And then I realized, no, that is a complete fabrication. You can totally not eat meat. In fact, there's lots of evidence to show that the Prophet, peace be upon him, ate meat very rarely. And I've heard that that more so goes along with the time period and that it was like very expensive to eat meat. Meat was a luxury. But you can look this up. Like, this is not even an unknown thing. This is a very like widely known thing that people at the time in general did not eat much meat, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, specifically didn't eat too much meat. So again, this notion that, oh, you have to eat meat, it was just coming out of the blue for me. And once I actually did my own research and really looked into it, I realized, no, that's definitely not true. So another thing I'll mention as a red flag that you should look out for when somebody is giving you advice. This one is not as much with the actual advice itself. It's more so how the person is delivering it. So as I've been saying, you should, ask more questions. If somebody's telling you a piece of information or advice and it's not really adding up, it's not really making sense to you, you should be able to, inquire and ask more questions if you feel comfortable with that person. You can always just do the research on your own, but it can be more convenient just to ask them in the moment. So if you do that, if you kind of push back a little bit, even in a very respectful and kind way, which is what you should do, if you ask kind of like, hey, where did you hear that? You know what I mean? Like, is there a hadith or whatever it might be? If the way they respond is by getting annoyed, getting defensive, getting reluctant to tell you anything more, reluctant to give you a further explanation or any kind of references where they heard it, who they heard it from, here's some people to look it up, look into, or here's a video to watch about it. They don't want to do any of that, and they get, again, annoyed or defensive. That is a big red flag. This is something that happens in life in general, you guys. Like, I think we've all known that person that will just kind of say things, you know what I'm saying? They just pull things out of nowhere and they'll just say, some random nonsense because they want to sound smart. They want to sound smart. They want to sound like they know everything. Again, it happens everywhere, not just with Islam. And I think most of us have had an experience where you say, where did you hear that? Because I've never heard that before. And the person gets annoyed. And that's pretty much a surefire way of knowing that it it was not a true fact, or it was at least not something they really knew much about. They were just, saying whatever because they wanted to sound smart. So this is again just kind of a common sense thing in life in general. If you ask for, where are you getting that information from, and the person doesn't want to tell you, or they get annoyed that you're not just taking them at face value and immediately accepting what they're telling you, that is a red flag. First of all, in the advice they're giving you, whatever they were talking about, but it's also a red flag in that person, to be honest. Like maybe if this is your friend, you want to kind of maybe take a step back and reevaluate things and think about it, because in my humble opinion, that indicates some level of narcissism. Because you shouldn't be, especially with Islamic advice, you should not be getting mad if people are asking you for references. You should never be getting mad if someone's asking you for references on something that you're not an expert on. You should be humble enough to know that, and know you're not an expert, and know that you should refer people out to experts. So if you're mad about that, if you're mad about someone bringing attention to the fact that you don't deserve to be giving this information out, even if it's in a very respectful way, if that makes someone mad, I would say that's a red flag, again, with the whole person. So something definitely to look out for if that's a friend of yours going forward. Okay, and the last really quick thing I'll mention, the last red flag I'll mention before I just have some more disclaimers and basically how to deal with these situations. The last one I'll mention is if it literally just sounds weird to you. Again, this kind of goes along with you've never heard anything about it before. But trust your gut instinct. Please trust this feeling you get in your stomach when somebody tells you something and it just sounds weird. It's a unique feeling that like somebody will give you a, again, supposed ruling or something that you should be avoiding, and you're just like, what? Like, what are you talking about? That's just so bizarre to me. Like I've definitely been told things like that before, that again, like you have to eat meat. I'm like, what? The only restrictions we have on eating food in general as Muslims is meat we have to avoid. So, and you're sitting here and telling me I have to eat meat? What kind of meat do I have to eat? Do I have to eat every kind of meat? Like, what are you talking? You know what I mean? Like that just sounds very weird to me. So if somebody's saying something that just straight up sounds weird, it just does not sit right with you, it gives you a weird feeling, and your gut is telling you, I don't like this, definitely look more into it. Okay, and so with all of those being said, what do you do when you're in the situation that you're a new revert, somebody's giving you this advice, supposed, rulings, and it feels weird, you're getting a weird feeling, it doesn't seem true, doesn't align with logic, it doesn't align with what we know of Islam, but you don't know what to do from there. So what do we do in this situation? The first thing that you would want to do in this situation, in my opinion, the best thing you can possibly do, is talk to a sheikh or imam that you personally know. And so if you're a revert, you probably don't personally know any. However, if there's a masjid anywhere near you, you have the ability to go there, or even, inshallah, hopefully they can even have their email provided so you can do that and it'll be a lot easier. But you should be able to reach out to them and go to them for questions, because that's, a part of their job is to be able to answer these things and to clarify things for Muslims who are not sure about what they should be doing, and wanting to strive and be better Muslims. They should be able to pass that judgment down and be able to say, based on what I believe, and the school of thought I follow, etc., and be able to give you some information there. So definitely talking to a sheikh or imam in person, or at least communicating through email, like an interaction where you're actually talking to them, that would be best. That's definitely ideal, because then there's not going to be any question of like what they're trying to say, because It's not like you're watching a pre-recorded thing, you're talking to them, and you can ask them questions in real time. So that's definitely going to be your number one. If that's impossible, if that doesn't seem like something you can do, which inshallah it is possible no matter where you are, because again, you always have access to the internet. So even if there's literally no masjids around you, you should be able to find one somewhere, in the greater whatever area. Let's say you live in Wisconsin and there's like no masjids near you, but you can find a masjid in Wisconsin somewhere. If you're in that situation, I don't know how many Muslims are in Wisconsin. I'm just using this as an example. But let's say you're in that situation, you find one like 100 miles away from you, at least try to get an email from them, try to give them a call, do something like that. You see what I'm saying? So try, inshallah, to get in contact with an actual scholar, an actual imam. That is number one. That's the best thing to do when you have a question like this and you can't seem to find the answer on your own. Another thing you can do, which is not as ideal, but you can still try, is looking it up online. So it's not ideal because you're going to find a lot of crazy people online. That's just the reality. And you know what? The crazy thing is, people will go online and give, again, quote unquote, Islamic advice or rulings, and they're not even Muslim, and they're doing it purposely to misguide people. People, unfortunately, actually do that. It's really insane the amount of time people have on their hands and how much they really hate us. So I don't know how big of an issue that is, but it is actually something that happens. And even for the people who aren't fake Muslims, like literally they're not Muslims and they're trying to smear our name, you'll still just come across extremists. Honestly, sometimes you'll look things up and you'll come across extremists, because the reality is people with extreme opinions have the loudest voice. And so unfortunately, they'll be able to reach a bigger audience and they'll be able to have a bigger impact, and their name will pop up more times when you're looking up questions because of these things they're saying. So you have to look out for that. You have to look out for extremists. You have to look out for people who are literally not Muslim and they're saying things that are just not true at all, which is really hard to know as a new Muslim. And again, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I don't know how widespread of an issue that is, but it is an issue. So if you are looking up something online, something that I tried to do was really comb through some of the popular scholars and sheikhs and learn more about their background, learn more about their school of thought, which if you don't know about school of thought, don't worry about it. It's something you'll probably learn more later on. And it's not a big deal. It's not like a sect. It's not like you have to follow one school of thought and that's it. However, and the thing is, they're all correct. Okay, no matter what, like it's not a matter of one's right, one's wrong. It's a matter of they think of things differently, and they all have evidence behind it. They all have hadith backing it up. They have reasons for why they do things. So, however, like for me, for example, I go to a masjid where the imam and the majority of the people at the masjid follow the Hanafi school of thought. And so I'm going to be more inclined to listen to a scholar who's of that school of thought, because that's just already where I'm at. And, I've been told before, again, Allah knows best, but to my understanding, if you're not a scholar, if you're not a student of knowledge, if you don't know these things, and you're just starting out, it's best to just follow the school of thought that your local masjid that you attend, that masjid is. So again, in my case, the one that I go to is Hanafi. And so that's generally, I incline more towards that just because it's more cohesive. And that should show you how little these things really matter, because it literally is just like, yeah, whichever one it's near you. That's how I was told before. And that's how I understand it. So I try to follow someone who is like of the same school of thought as the masjid that I go to, again, just for cohesiveness, just because it makes it easier. That's something that even that you should ask a sheikh about like how much do schools of thought matter, because I can't give you that information. I'm not qualified. However, that is something to keep in mind. If you do already know about schools of thought, great, mashallah. And if you know that you follow one specifically that, your masjid follows, whatever it might be, then that's something to base it off of. Other than that, look at the, popular scholars that you find on whatever YouTube or whatever platform. Again, look into their background, because unfortunately, people might be really popular and have a lot of followers, but be saying things that are not true or that are misinformed. So this is definitely something that comes with time. You kind of have to figure out, which sheikhs do I know pretty much always have an on point answer, have very good reasons behind their answers, have hadith to back it up. They approach Islam the way that it's supposed to be approached. They're kind, they're non judgmental. You know what I mean? Like, which scholars can I trust that align with my beliefs? And they seem to be following Islam in the purest way possible. It'll take some time to figure that out, but once you have that nailed down, it becomes easier because then you can kind of look up, based on this person's opinion, what's the deal with this ruling, and usually you'll be able to find something. So that's definitely second to, or maybe even not second, maybe even further down. That is definitely not as good as talking to a sheikh or imam in person. But I know that as reverts, it can be difficult to get in contact with an imam, especially if we live in a very remote area where there's no masjids anywhere near. So that's another way you can go about it. Again, just finding a reputable source that you can come back to. And that's even, actually, now that I think of it, that's even something you can ask an imam so that you don't keep coming back to that imam himself. You can kind of say, like, hey, can you give me some resources that I can refer to for when I have questions? Maybe they have a person designated to do that. But even if not, and if he can't, doesn't have the capacity to keep answering every question, inshallah, they'll know some resources that they can refer you to, so you can get some knowledge there. So that's an option as well. And just in general, it's important to find someone that you trust to go to consistently with Islamic questions. So whether that be a friend that they're good with Islam, they're good with their deen, they're on top of it, and they're very knowledgeable, whether that be, in that situation, or whether it be, your spouse, if you're married to a Muslim who's been Muslim for a lot longer than you, whether they're born Muslim or a revert, that can definitely be beneficial. Or if you're able to, ideally, come across a mentor, somehow get a mentor, whether it's through your masjid or whatever it might be. Alhamdulillah, I was able to get a mentor through my masjid, and she has been such a great help to me. Alhamdulillah. And so that would be ideal for sure, to get a mentor, because then this person, whenever you come to them, they're going to give you a good answer, or they're going to refer you to the right place, or they're going to do the work themselves actually and look it up and then come back to you and say, here's what I found. So definitely, I hope this all is making sense, that the number one thing you want to look for is real life interaction. Ideally, again, sheikh, imam, somebody who really knows what they're talking about. And if not them, then, a Muslim that is reputable, or a scholar, sheikh, somebody who's very knowledgeable. Even if you don't know them, you can't talk to them in person. So hopefully that kind of helps. It's definitely something that I can't give you every piece of advice on, because it's a difficult thing to navigate, and it kind of just comes with time. You kind of just figure these things out with time, what to look out for, red flags to avoid or to keep in mind when someone's giving you advice, and then furthermore, ways to verify things that people are telling you. So inshallah, that was helpful. I hope that helped you if you're a revert. I hope you found this to be relatable. maybe I don't want it to be relatable, but I hope you're able to feel affirmed if you do relate to some of the things I mentioned, some of the crazy rulings people will throw out there. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy on us all that are striving to get back into Islam or get into Islam, whether we're reverts and we never were Muslim before. We were born into a non-Muslim family, or if we were born Muslims who were raised Muslim and strayed away and then came back to Islam. Whatever situation we might be in, as long as we're striving to learn more about Islam, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us, and may He always direct us in the right place and make it known to us where we should be going to for genuine, truthful advice. Ameen. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again very soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.